The crystal shards caught the light from the chandeliers like tiny diamonds scattered across vanilla buttercream, and for one terrible moment, Elena Martinez-Chen thought they were decorative sugar crystals. The wedding cake, 3 tiers of her grandmother's recipe, lovingly recreated by the best bakery in San Francisco, stood before her like a beautiful lie, its perfection marred by something that glittered with malicious intent. "Go ahead, sweetheart," her Aunt Carmen whispered from behind, voice dripping with false honey. "Take the first bite. You've earned it." The reception hall buzzed with the gentle murmur of 200 guests, most of whom had traveled across the country to celebrate what should have been the happiest day of Elena's life. White roses cascaded from tall centerpieces, their fragrance mixing with the scent of garlic and cumin from the fusion menu she and David had spent months perfecting. Mexican traditions woven seamlessly with David's Chinese heritage, paper dragons hung alongside papel picado, creating a tapestry of cultures that represented their love story. But something was wrong. Elena felt it in the way certain family members clustered in the corner, whispering behind their champagne flutes. She felt it in the weight of stares that followed her across the dance floor, in the forced smiles that never quite reached familiar eyes. Most of all, she felt it in the tremor that had started in her hands 3 hours ago and refused to stop. David stood beside her, his hand warm and steady on the small of her back, his dark eyes reflecting the same confusion she felt. At 28, he was everything her family had claimed to want for her: successful, kind, devoted. He ran a nonprofit that provided technology education to underserved communities, spoke 3 languages fluently, and had spent the morning helping Elena's elderly uncle Felix into his wheelchair with such genuine care that it brought tears to her eyes. "The glass looks beautiful in this light," her cousin Maria said, stepping closer with her phone raised to capture the moment. Her smile was sharp as broken china. "Almost real, doesn't it?" Elena's breath caught. Glass, not sugar crystals. The realization hit her like ice water, and suddenly every strange interaction from the past week began to make sense. The hushed phone calls that stopped when she entered rooms, the way her mother, Isabella, had been avoiding eye contact for days, the mysterious delay in the cake delivery that morning, blamed on traffic but explained with nervous laughter. "I don't understand," Elena whispered, her voice barely audible above the mariachi music that had seemed so joyful just moments ago. The lead guitarist, a family friend named Roberto, had been playing Elena's favorites since she was 7 years old. Now his music felt like a soundtrack to her confusion. Her father, Miguel, approached from the left side of the cake table. At 55, he was still the man who had taught her to ride a bicycle in Golden Gate Park, who had stayed up all night helping her with calculus homework, who had cried when she graduated from Stanford with her master's in social work. But the man walking toward her now wore an expression she had never seen before: cold, calculating, almost predatory. "Elena, mija," he said, his voice carrying across the immediate vicinity despite its quiet tone. "We need to talk about some things that have come to light." The cake knife felt impossibly heavy in her hands. It was an antique silver piece that had belonged to David's grandmother, engraved with delicate cherry blossoms. They had chosen it together from his family's collection, a symbol of honoring the past while building something new. Now it trembled as Elena's hands shook with a fear she couldn't name. "Papa, what's happening?" she asked, but her father's eyes had already shifted to the small crowd that was gathering around them. Elena recognized the faces: her mother's 3 sisters, her father's brother and his wife, several cousins who had flown in from Los Angeles and Mexico City. David's parents stood slightly apart, their confusion evident as they tried to understand the rapid Spanish being whispered around them.
27 years, her Aunt Rosa said, stepping forward with a manila envelope clutched in her manicured hands. Rosa had always been the family's unofficial record keeper, the one who organized reunions and maintained the elaborate family tree that hung in Elena's grandmother's living room. 27 years we've loved you, supported you, celebrated your achievements. Elena's heart began to race. The envelope looked official, government-issued, with edges worn from handling. Rosa's expression was a mixture of heartbreak and fury that Elena had never witnessed directed at her before. "Rosa, please," David said, his voice steady but concerned. "What's going on? Elena, do you know what they're talking about?" But Elena couldn't respond because the world was beginning to tilt sideways. The mariachi music continued, Roberto's fingers moving expertly across the guitar strings, but it sounded distant now, like music playing in another room, another lifetime. The scent of the white roses had become cloying, almost suffocating, and the crystal shards in the cake seemed to multiply before her eyes. "Fraud," Carmen whispered, the words sliding between her lips like a snake. "All these years, living as our family when you never belonged to us at all?" Elena felt David's arm tighten around her waist, felt his body shift protectively in front of her, but she couldn't process what was happening fast enough to respond. The reception hall, which had been filled with laughter and music just minutes before, had fallen into an eerie quiet. Even the children, who had been running between tables in their miniature suits and frilly dresses, had stopped to stare. "Show her," Miguel said quietly, and Rosa opened the envelope with the solemnity of someone delivering a death sentence. The papers inside were photocopied but official, bearing the seal of the California Department of Health. Elena caught glimpses of words that didn't make sense in this context: birth certificate, amended records, biological parents, adoption decree. Her legs suddenly felt weak, and she was grateful for David's steady presence beside her. "These came in the mail last week," Isabella finally spoke, her voice thick with tears. Elena turned to look at her mother, the woman who had braided her hair for school every morning, who had taught her to make tamales from scratch, who had held her through countless heartbreaks and celebrated every triumph. Isabella's face was streaked with mascara, her carefully applied makeup ruined by tears Elena hadn't even noticed her crying. "Mommy!" Elena reached for her mother instinctively, but Isabella stepped back as if her touch might burn her. "The adoption agency," Isabella said, her words coming out in broken English and Spanish mixed together. "They made a mistake, a clerical error," they said. "You were supposed to go to the family in Oregon. We got the baby meant for them." Elena felt the world continue its sideways slide. The cake knife slipped from her numb fingers and clattered onto the white linen tablecloth, leaving a small silver scratch on the table beneath. "What are you saying?" "We're saying," Carmen continued, her voice rising enough for nearby tables to hear clearly, "that you are not Elena Martinez. You never were. Your real name is Sarah Chen, and your biological parents died in a car accident when you were 3 months old. We raised someone else's child for 27 years thinking she was ours." The silence that followed was deafening. Elena could hear her own heartbeat, could feel David's hand gripping hers so tightly it almost hurt, could smell the vanilla and butter of the cake that now looked like a prop in some surreal nightmare. Somewhere in the background, she heard chairs scraping against the hardwood floor as guests began to turn and stare. "That's impossible," David said firmly, his voice cutting through the tension. "Elena, this is clearly some kind of mistake or misunderstanding. We can sort this out after."
"After what?" Miguel interrupted, his voice hardening. "After we continue to pretend that our entire family dynamic hasn't been built on a lie? After we act like it doesn't matter that we poured our hearts and resources and love into someone who was never meant to be ours?" Elena found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "I don't understand how that changes anything. I'm still me. I'm still your daughter, your niece, your cousin. Biology doesn't erase 27 years. Doesn't it?" Rosa asked, and her tone was so cold that Elena felt it like a physical blow. "Because the Elena Martinez we thought we knew wouldn't have hidden something like this from us. The Elena Martinez we thought we knew would have told us the truth." "I didn't know!" Elena exclaimed, her voice finally finding strength. "How could I have known? You're telling me this information came to you last week. This is the first I'm hearing any of it." "Is it?" Carmen asked, and there was something calculating in her expression that made Elena's stomach clench with dread. "Because we made some phone calls, Elena, to the adoption agency, to the lawyers involved, to the social workers. Turns out this isn't the first inquiry about your case. Someone's been asking questions about your background for months." Elena felt David stiffen beside her. She turned to look at him, searching his face for any sign of recognition or guilt, but found only genuine confusion and growing anger. "You think I've been investigating my own adoption?" Elena asked incredulously. "Why would I do that? Why would anyone do that?" "Maybe," Rosa said, her voice dripping with suspicion, "because you knew this day would come. Maybe because you've been planning to get whatever you could from this family before we found out the truth." The accusation hit Elena like a physical slap. She staggered backward, her elaborate wedding dress, a gorgeous creation of silk and lace that had taken 6 months to design and fit, suddenly feeling like a costume she had no right to wear. "How can you say that to me?" she whispered. "How can you think that about me? I've never asked for anything from this family except love. I've never taken anything I wasn't freely given. I work 2 jobs. I pay my own bills. I've been financially independent since college." "Have you?" Miguel asked, and Elena realized with growing horror that this confrontation had been planned, orchestrated, timed for maximum impact. "Because we looked into that too, mija. Your college tuition, your graduate school expenses, the down payment on your apartment, the money for this wedding. All of it came from family contributions. All of it came from people who thought they were investing in their own flesh and blood." Elena's vision blurred with tears she hadn't realized were forming. Every financial gift, every family contribution that had helped her build her life was being reframed as theft, as fraud, as taking something under false pretenses. "I never asked for any of that money," she said desperately. "You offered it. All of you offered it because you said you wanted to help me succeed, because you said you were proud of me." "We were proud," Isabella said, and her voice broke on the words. "We were so proud of our daughter. But you're not our daughter, are you? You never were." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Elena felt something fundamental crack inside her chest, as if the very foundation of her identity was crumbling. She looked around at the faces surrounding her, faces that had been at every birthday party, every graduation, every holiday celebration of her life. Now they looked at her like she was a stranger, an imposter, someone who had tricked them into loving her. "The cake," she said suddenly, her gaze falling back to the destroyed dessert. "You put glass in the cake. You could have killed someone." "Fake crystals," Carmen corrected with a cruel smile. "Just like everything else about tonight. Just like everything else about you." But Elena could see that they were real glass shards, could see the way they caught and refracted the light differently than any decorative sugar could. Someone in her family, people who claimed to have loved her for 27 years, had deliberately sabotaged her wedding cake in a way that could cause serious physical harm.
"Who did this?" she asked, her voice gaining strength from her growing anger. "Who put glass in my cake?" The silence that followed told her everything she needed to know. It hadn't been one person acting alone in anger or grief. It had been a group decision, a coordinated effort to humiliate her on what was supposed to be the most important day of her life. David stepped forward, his protective instincts finally overriding his shock. "That's enough," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to standing up for others. "I don't care what papers you have or what you think you've discovered, you do not sabotage someone's wedding, you do not put glass in food, and you do not ambush someone with information like this in front of 200 guests." "We have every right to confront the fraud in our family," Rosa said. But David was already moving, his hand on Elena's elbow, guiding her away from the cake table. "Elena," he said quietly, "we're leaving, right now." But as they turned to walk away, Elena heard her father's voice one more time, carrying clearly across the reception hall. "Don't bother coming to family events anymore, Sarah. You don't belong there. You never did." The name Elena hit Elena like a final blow. Not Elena, the name that had been whispered to her in lullabies and called out across playgrounds and written on birthday cards for 27 years. Sarah, a stranger's name, the name of someone who had died in a car accident before she was old enough to remember her own face. As David led her toward the exit, Elena caught sight of herself in one of the mirrors that lined the reception hall walls. She looked like a ghost, her brown skin pale with shock, her dark eyes wide and unseeing, her black hair falling from its elaborate updo in tendrils that framed her face like question marks. Behind them, the mariachi music had stopped completely. The reception hall had fallen into an uncomfortable silence, broken only by the whispered conversations of confused guests and the sound of Elena's heels clicking against the hardwood floor as she walked away from the only family she had ever known. But as they reached the doorway, Elena heard something that made her freeze in her tracks. It was the sound of someone crying, not the angry, frustrated tears of family members who felt betrayed, but the broken, heartbroken sobs of genuine loss. She turned to see her grandmother, Abuela Rosa, sitting alone at the head table. At 82, Rosa Martinez was the matriarch of the family, the keeper of recipes and traditions, the woman who had taught Elena to dance salsa in the kitchen while dinner cooked on the stove. She was crying as if her heart was breaking, her small hands pressed to her face, her shoulders shaking with grief. Elena took a step toward her, but her uncle Carlos moved to block her path. "You've done enough damage," he said quietly. "Leave her alone." And Elena realized that in the span of 20 minutes, she had lost everything. Not just her identity, not just her understanding of her own history, but her entire family, her sense of belonging, her place in the world. As David opened the door to lead her out into the San Francisco evening, Elena looked back one more time at the reception that should have been celebrating her new life. Instead, it looked like the scene of a funeral. Her funeral, the death of Elena Martinez, leaving behind only questions, accusations, and the glittering shards of broken glass in a cake that no one would ever eat. The silence in David Honda Civic was broken only by the soft hum of the heater and Elena's occasional shuddering breaths. They drove through the empty streets of San Francisco's Mission District, past the murals that had always made Elena feel proud of her heritage, past the panaderias where she'd bought conchas every Sunday morning with her grandmother, past the community center where she'd volunteered teaching ESL classes to recent immigrants, people she'd felt connected to through shared language and culture. Now, as they passed these familiar landmarks, Yelena felt like a tourist in her own life. David pulled into the parking space outside their shared apartment, the place they'd planned to return to as husband and wife, where wedding gifts waited unopened in neat piles on their dining room table. Instead, Yelena sat motionless in the passenger seat, still wearing her wedding dress, still feeling the phantom weight of the crown of flowers that had fallen from her hair somewhere between the cake table and the car. "Yelena," David said softly, his hand reaching across the center console to touch hers. His fingers were warm, real, the only thing that felt solid in a world that had become fluid and unreliable. "We need to get you inside. We need to figure out what just happened." She turned to look at him, this man she'd married 4 hours ago, and felt a wave of gratitude mixed with guilt. David Chen had joined his life to hers, had promised to love and support her, had no idea he was signing up for this kind of chaos and confusion. His parents, quiet and dignified, had watched the confrontation unfold with the polite horror of people witnessing a car accident they couldn't prevent. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, the first words she'd spoken since leaving the reception hall. "David, I'm so sorry. Your family must think—" "My family thinks your family acted abominably," David interrupted, his voice firm. "My parents are horrified. My sister is calling what happened tonight emotional abuse. And they're right." Yelena unbuckled her seatbelt with shaking hands, the simple mechanism suddenly seeming impossibly complex. Everything felt different now. Not just her understanding of her identity, but the physical world around her. The streetlights seemed too bright, the familiar sounds of the city too loud. Even the texture of her wedding dress felt wrong against her skin. As they climbed the stairs to their second-floor apartment, Yelena caught sight of herself in the hallway mirror. The woman looking at her was a stranger. Or rather, she was someone Yelena was seeing clearly for the first time. The almond shape of her eyes, which she'd always attributed to some distant indigenous ancestry, suddenly looked more Asian than Latino. Her hair, thick and straight and black, which she'd always assumed came from her father's side of the family, now seemed to tell a different story entirely. "I need to take the stress off,"
Elena said suddenly, her voice sounding strange in her own ears. "I need to get out of this dress right now." David nodded and unlocked their front door, holding it open for her to pass through. Their apartment, normally a source of comfort and pride, now felt like a museum of a life that might have been built on false foundations. Wedding cards covered their kitchen table, gifts wrapped in silver and white lined their living room shelves, and in the corner sat the easel holding the large photo collage Yelena had made for the reception. 4 poster boards covered with pictures of Yelena and David, interspersed with photos of both their families throughout the years. Yelena stared at the collage with new eyes. There she was at 5 years old, grinning between her parents at Disneyland. At 10, helping her grandmother make tamales for Christmas. At 15, surrounded by cousins at a family barbecue. At 22, graduating from Stanford with Miguel's proud arm around her shoulders. Every photo told the story of Elena Martinez, beloved daughter and niece and granddaughter, integral part of a large, loving Mexican-American family. But if what they told her tonight was true, every single photo was evidence of a life that had been built on a mistake. "Elena," David said gently, following her gaze to the photo collage, "whatever those papers say, whatever happened with the adoption, those photos are real. Those moments are real. The love in those pictures is real." She turned away from the photos and headed toward their bedroom, needing desperately to get out of the elaborate dress that now felt like a costume. As David helped her with the dozens of tiny buttons that ran down her back, Yelena found herself studying their reflection in the dresser mirror. David, with his Chinese features and warm brown eyes, looked exactly like what he was, the son of immigrants who had built a successful life in America while maintaining strong connections to their heritage.
Elena had always thought she looked like what she was, too. A second-generation Mexican-American, the product of parents who had worked hard to give their daughter opportunities they'd never had. But now, looking at herself objectively for the first time, she could see features that didn't quite fit the story she'd been told. The shape of her nose, the structure of her cheekbones, the way her skin tone was different from both her parents. Details she'd never questioned because children don't analyze their own faces for genetic inconsistencies. "What if it's true?" she asked quietly as the dress finally loosened enough for her to step out of it. "What if I really am Sarah Chen? What if everything I think I know about myself is wrong?" David hung the dress carefully in their closet, handling it with the same reverence he might show a museum piece. "Then we figure out what that means," he said simply. "But Elena, even if the biological facts are different than you thought, you're still you. You still have 27 years of memories, experiences, relationships that shaped who you are. You still speak Spanish fluently and make the best salsa verde I've ever tasted. You still cry every time you hear mariachi music because it reminds you of dancing with your grandfather. You still volunteer at the community center every Saturday morning. Those things don't disappear because of a birth certificate." Elena pulled on a pair of jeans and an old Stanford sweatshirt, clothes that felt more like her real self than the wedding dress had. But even as she changed, she found herself questioning everything. Did she really love spicy food because of her Mexican heritage or because that's what she'd grown up eating? Did she feel connected to Latino culture because it was in her blood or because it was the environment she'd been raised in? How much of identity was nature versus nurture, and what happened when you discovered you'd been wrong about the nature part? "I need to see the papers," she said suddenly. "I need to see exactly what they found." David nodded and reached for his phone. "I'll call my uncle, the one who's a lawyer. He can help us understand the legal implications and maybe verify whether the documents are authentic." But Elena was already shaking her head. "Not tonight. I can't deal with lawyers and legal implications tonight. I just need to understand what they think they know." She moved to their computer, her fingers trembling as she opened a browser window. For a moment, she stared at the blank search page, unsure what to even look for. Finally, she typed in her own name, Elena Martinez, Adoption, San Francisco. The search returned nothing useful, a few social media profiles, a mention in a local newspaper when she'd won a community service award last year, her professional bio from the nonprofit where she worked. Normal results for a normal person living a normal life.
Then she tried Sarah Chen, adoption, Oregon, car accident, and her breath caught in her throat. The third result was a newspaper article from 28 years ago. Young couple dies in highway accident, infant daughter survives. With David reading over her shoulder, Elena clicked on the link. The article was brief, clinical in its description of a tragedy that had destroyed one family while creating the conditions for another. James and Lee Chen, both 26, had died instantly when their car skidded on ice and hit a tree during a winter storm in Portland. They left behind a 3-month-old daughter, Sarah, who had been in a car seat in the back and survived with minor injuries. The article mentioned that Sarah would be placed for adoption through a private agency that specialized in finding homes for Asian American children. It didn't mention anything about mix-ups or mistakes, but it did provide a date that made Elena's stomach clench. Sarah Chen had been born on the same day as Elena Martinez, March 15, 1997. The same birthday, David said quietly. Elena, what are the odds that 2 babies born on the same day would be mixed up in an adoption? Elena continued scrolling, looking for more information, but the trail went cold quickly. She tried searching for the adoption agency mentioned in the article, but it had apparently closed down 15 years ago. She looked for any other mentions of the Chen family, but found only a brief obituary for James Chen's mother, who had died the year after the accident, reportedly of a broken heart.
They had no other family, Elena realized, reading the obituary carefully. Sarah Chen's grandparents were dead. Her parents were only children. When James and Lee died, she had no one. David pulled a chair up next to her, and Elena leaned into his warmth, needing the comfort of his physical presence. Elena, he said carefully, even if this is all true, even if there was some kind of mix-up at the adoption agency, that doesn't justify what your family did tonight. People don't put glass in wedding cakes because they're upset about paperwork. Elena turned to face him fully, seeing her own confusion reflected in his eyes. But don't you see? If I'm not really their biological daughter, if I'm not really Elena Martinez, then everything changes. All the money they spent on my education, all the family traditions I participated in, all the love and support they gave me. What if they feel like it was given under false pretenses? What false pretenses? David asked, his voice rising slightly with frustration. You were a baby, Elena. Even if there was a mix-up, even if you were supposed to go to a different family, you were 3 months old. You had no agency in any of this. You've lived your entire life believing you were Elena Martinez, because that's what everyone told you. How is any of this your fault? Elena stood up and walked to their kitchen window, looking out at the city where she'd been born and raised. Somewhere out there, maybe, was another family, the Martinez family who had been expecting a baby and instead received someone else. Had they spent the last 27 years wondering about their biological daughter? Had they tried to find her? Or had they simply loved the child they received and never asked questions? What if there's another Elena out there? She asked quietly. What if there's a woman my age who was supposed to be raised by my parents, who's been living with a different family all this time? David joined her at the window, wrapping his arms around her from behind. Then that's something we'll help you figure out. But Elena, you need to understand something. Whatever we discover, whatever the truth turns out to be, it doesn't change the fundamental fact that you are who you are. Your personality, your values, your dreams, your fears, your way of seeing the world, those things aren't determined by a name on a birth certificate. Elena leaned back against his chest, trying to absorb the truth of what he was saying. But it was difficult when everything she'd used to define herself suddenly seemed questionable. She thought about her job at the nonprofit, working with immigrant families to help them navigate social services and educational systems. She'd always felt that her bilingual abilities and cultural understanding gave her a special connection to her clients. Now she wondered if that connection was real or imagined, based on shared heritage or simply shared language learned in childhood. I don't know how to be Sarah Chen. I don't know anything about being Chinese American. I don't know the language, the culture, the traditions. If I'm not Elena Martinez, then
Who am I? David turned her around to face him, his hands gentle on her shoulders. You're Elena, he said firmly. Maybe not Elena Martinez, maybe Sarah Chen legally, but you're Elena. You're the woman who cries at romantic comedies and burns everything she tries to cook except scrambled eggs. You're the woman who speaks to every dog we pass on the street and remembers the names of all our neighbors' children. You're the woman who spent 3 hours yesterday making sure your grandmother's favorite song would be played at our reception, who worried for weeks that your cousin's kids wouldn't have fun at the wedding. Elena felt tears building behind her eyes as she listened to David describe her, not through the lens of cultural identity or family lineage, but through the small, specific details that made up a life. These were things that would remain true regardless of what any official document said about her origins. But my family, she said, her voice breaking slightly. David, they looked at me like a stranger tonight, like 27 years of love and shared experiences meant nothing. Then they're wrong, David said simply. And honestly, Elena, the way they handled tonight tells me more about them than it does about you. People who truly love someone don't ambush them with life-changing information at their wedding reception. They don't sabotage their cake and humiliate them in front of 200 guests. Whatever their feelings about this adoption situation, their behavior was cruel and calculated.
Elena knew he was right, but the knowledge didn't ease the ache in her chest. She kept thinking about her grandmother's tears, about the way her mother had stepped back from her touch as if Elena had become toxic. These were people who had been constants in her life, who had shaped her understanding of family loyalty and unconditional love. The fact that their love apparently did have conditions, and that those conditions could be revoked based on genetics, was almost more devastating than the identity crisis itself. "I need to call them," she said suddenly. "I need to try to fix this, to explain." "Elena, no." David's voice was firmer than she'd ever heard it. "What would you explain? What would you fix? You did nothing wrong. You have nothing to apologize for." But Elena was already reaching for her phone, scrolling to her mother's contact information. Isabella Martinez had been the first person she called with good news, bad news, or no news at all. The idea of having this gulf between them, of Isabella thinking of her as a fraud or an imposter, was unbearable. The phone rang 4 times before going to voicemail. Elena listened to her mother's familiar voice. "You've reached Isabella. Please leave a message." And felt her heart break a little more. Even the voicemail greeting sounded different now, like it belonged to a stranger. "Mommy, it's me. It's Elena. I know you're angry. I know you're hurt. But please call me back. We need to talk about this. I love you. I've always loved you. That hasn't changed." She hung up and immediately dialed her father's number, then her grandmother's, then her Aunt Rosa's. Every call went to voicemail. Either they were all genuinely unavailable, or they had made a collective decision not to speak to her. "They've shut me out completely," she realized, sinking onto their living room couch. "And one night I've lost my entire family." David sat beside her, pulling her close. "You haven't lost me," he said quietly, "and you haven't lost my family. My parents are horrified by what happened tonight, but they're horrified on your behalf, not disappointed in you. My sister already texted to ask if there's anything she can do to help. You still have family, Elena. Maybe not the family you expected, but you have family." Elena leaned into his warmth, grateful for his unwavering support, even as she struggled to process the magnitude of what had changed in her life. Tomorrow she would have to face practical questions. Should she try to find out more about Sarah Chen's biological family? Should she attempt legal verification of the adoption documents? Should she reach out to the Martinez family who might have received the baby meant for her? But tonight, she just wanted to sit in her apartment with her husband and try to figure out how to be Elena or Sarah or whoever she was in a world that had suddenly become completely unfamiliar. As if reading her thoughts, David asked quietly, "What do you want to do tomorrow?" Elena considered the question seriously. Part of her wanted to dive immediately into research to find out everything she could about Sarah Chen and the circumstances of the adoption.
Another part wanted to show up at her parents' house and demand they explain how they could turn their backs on 27 years of love because of some paperwork. But mostly, she just wanted to wake up and discover this had all been a terrible nightmare. "I want to go to work," she said finally. "I want to do something normal, something that reminds me who I am outside of all this family drama. And then, maybe I want to find out what really happened 27 years ago." David nodded, understanding that she needed to approach this crisis in manageable steps, rather than trying to solve everything at once. "We'll figure it out together," he promised. "Whatever the truth turns out to be, we'll handle it together." Elena closed her eyes and tried to imagine what tomorrow would bring. For now, it was enough to know that even if she had lost the family she'd known all her life, she still had David, still had her sense of self, still had a life built on more than just genetics and birth certificates. But as she drifted towards sleep in David's arms, still wearing her jeans and Stanford sweatshirt instead of the beautiful nightgown she had bought for her wedding night, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of a journey that would change everything she thought she knew about herself and the world around her.
Elena's alarm went off at 6:30 a.m., the same time it had every weekday for the past 3 years. For exactly 15 seconds, she lay in bed listening to the familiar sound and feeling the warm weight of David's arm across her waist, everything normal and peaceful. Then, reality crashed back over her like a cold wave, and she remembered that she was no longer Elena Martinez, beloved daughter and granddaughter, but possibly Sarah Chen, a stranger to herself and apparently a fraud to everyone who had ever loved her. David stirred beside her, instantly alert in the way that had always impressed her. "How are you feeling?" he asked softly, his voice still rough with sleep. Elena considered the question seriously. She felt hollowed out, as if someone had scooped away all the certainties that had once filled her chest and left behind only questions and the echo of cruel words. But she also felt oddly determined, like a person who had survived a natural disaster and now needed to survey the damage and begin rebuilding. "I feel like I need to understand what really happened," she said. "And I feel like I need to prove to myself that I'm still me, regardless of what any adoption papers say." The morning routine helped ground her. Shower, coffee, the ritual of getting dressed for work. Elena chose her clothes carefully. A professional but approachable navy blazer, comfortable shoes for walking between client appointments, the small silver cross necklace her grandmother had given her for her quinceañera. If she was going to face a world that might question her identity, she wanted to armor herself in the symbols of the person she knew herself to be. The San Francisco Community Resource Center sat in a converted Victorian house in the Mission District, its bright yellow exterior and welcoming front porch designed to feel more like a neighborhood gathering place than a government office. Elena had been working there for 4 years as a family liaison, helping immigrant families navigate everything from school enrollment to housing applications to citizenship processes. It was work that had always felt like a calling rather than just a job, a way to use her bilingual skills and cultural understanding to bridge gaps between communities. But as she climbed the front steps that Tuesday morning, Elena found herself wondering if her connection to the work was as authentic as she'd always believed. Did she really understand the immigrant experience? Or had she just been playing a role based on assumptions about her own heritage? "Elena!" Her colleague Maria Santos waved from the reception desk, her face lighting up with the genuine warmth that had made Elena love working here. "¿Cómo estuvo la boda? I'm so sorry I couldn't make it. My daughter's soccer tournament ran late, and you know how these things go." Elena felt her chest tighten. Maria was expecting to hear about a beautiful wedding, about dancing until midnight and cake-cutting photos, and all the joy that should have filled the weekend. Instead, Elena had to figure out how to explain that her wedding reception had turned into a public confrontation about her identity, complete with sabotage, desserts, and accusations of fraud. "It was complicated," Elena said carefully. "Maria, can we talk privately when you have a chance?"
Something in Elena's tone must have alerted Maria to the seriousness of the situation. She immediately stood up from her desk and guided Elena toward the small break room in the back of the building. "Mija, what happened? You look like you haven't slept." Elena hadn't planned to tell anyone at work about the adoption revelation. It felt too personal, too raw, too complicated to explain in the professional environment where she'd built her reputation as someone who helped other people solve their family crises. But sitting in the familiar break room, surrounded by the community resource posters and family photos that had always made this place feel like home, she found herself needing to confess to someone who might understand. "Maria," she began slowly, "what would you do if you found out that everything you thought you knew about your family was wrong?" Maria poured 2 cups of coffee from the perpetually brewing pot and settled into the chair across from Elena. At 45, she had the kind of maternal presence that made clients open up to her immediately, and Elena had always felt grateful to work alongside someone with such natural empathy.
Depend on what kind of wrong we're talking about, Maria said carefully. Family secrets, financial troubles, what? Elena took a deep breath and told Maria everything. The papers her family had received, the confrontation at the reception, the glass in the cake, the devastating realization that the people she'd loved most in the world were willing to reject her based on genetics. As she spoke, she watched Maria's expression shift from concern to shock to something that looked like recognition. "Ay, Elena," Maria said softly when the story was finished. "I'm so sorry. But Mija, I have to ask, did you ever suspect anything? Did you ever feel like you didn't quite fit?" The question hit Elena like a physical blow, because the answer was complicated. "Sometimes," she admitted quietly. "I mean, I always looked a little different from my parents and cousins, and there were small things. I was never very interested in telenovelas like the rest of the women in my family. I preferred different kinds of music. Sometimes I felt like I was performing Mexicanness rather than just living it. But I thought that was normal. I thought that was just generational differences or individual personality." Maria nodded thoughtfully. "You know, Elena, I've worked with a lot of families over the years, and I've seen how complicated identity can be for people who were adopted, especially across cultural lines. It doesn't matter if the adoption happened when you were 3 months old or 3 years old, there can still be this sense of not quite belonging, even in the most loving families. But they weren't just unloving last night, Maria. They were cruel. They humiliated me in front of 200 people. They made me feel like 27 years of love and support was all conditional on sharing their DNA." Maria reached across the table and took Elena's hand. "That was wrong of them, completely wrong. Whatever their feelings about this adoption situation, the way they handled it was inexcusable." She paused, then asked gently, "Have you tried to verify the information they showed you? Have you confirmed that these documents are real?" Elena shook her head. "I was too shocked last night to think clearly. But I did find a newspaper article about a couple named James and Lee Chen who died in a car accident, leaving behind a baby daughter named Sarah. The dates match up with my birthday." "That's not necessarily proof of anything," Maria pointed out. "Birth dates can be coincidences, and newspaper articles can be misinterpreted. If you want to know the truth, you need to see official documentation, not just photocopies your family claims to have received in the mail." Before Elena could respond, her phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at the screen and felt her stomach drop. It was from her cousin Luis, Miguel's son, someone she'd always considered more like a brother than a cousin. "Elena, I need to talk to you. Can you meet me for lunch? There are things you need to know that weren't said last night." She showed the message to Maria, who frowned as she read it. "Be careful, Mija. This could be an attempt to get you to admit to something, or it could be a genuine attempt to help. Do you trust this cousin?" She considered the question. Luis was 32, 5 years older than Elena, and had always been one of the family members she felt closest to. He was a teacher at a local high school, married with 2 young children, someone who had always seemed grounded and fair-minded. If anyone in the family might be willing to approach this situation rationally, it would be Luis. "I think I trust him," she said finally,
And I need to know what other information they have, what other accusations they might be planning to make. Maria squeezed Elena's hand. Then meet with him, but meet somewhere public, and maybe take David with you. Don't go into this alone. Elena nodded and texted Luis back, suggesting they meet at a small cafe in the Castro that was far enough from the mission to avoid running into other family members. Then she tried to focus on her work, hoping that helping other people with their problems might provide some perspective on her own situation.
Her first appointment was with the Hernandez family, recent immigrants from Guatemala who were struggling to enroll their teenage son in high school due to missing documentation from their home country. Elena spent an hour on the phone with various school district officials, translating between English and Spanish, advocating for the family's needs, helping them understand their rights and options. As she worked, Elena found herself thinking about identity in a new way. The Hernandez family had left behind everything familiar: their language, their culture, their extended family, their sense of belonging, to build a new life in America. Their son, 17-year-old Carlos, was caught between two worlds: the Guatemalan culture of his parents and the American culture of his new classmates. He spoke perfect English but still helped his parents navigate bureaucratic systems they couldn't understand alone. "It's hard," Carlos told Elena during a quiet moment when his parents were filling out paperwork. "Sometimes I feel like I'm not really Guatemalan anymore, but I'm not really American either. Like I exist in some space between identities." Elena felt a jolt of recognition. "How do you handle that feeling?" she asked. Carlos shrugged with the wisdom of someone far older than his 17 years. "I try to remember that identity isn't just about where you're from or what your parents are. It's about who you choose to be, what values you hold, how you treat other people. I can honor my Guatemalan heritage while also building an American life. They don't have to cancel each other out." The conversation stayed with Elena as she prepared to meet Louis for lunch. If a 17-year-old could navigate the complexities of cultural identity with such maturity, surely she could figure out how to be Elena or Sarah or whoever she was, regardless of what any adoption documents revealed. David offered to accompany her to lunch, but Elena decided she needed to face Louis alone. There were family dynamics and shared history that would be easier to navigate without an outsider present, even an outsider as supportive as her husband. The cafe Louis had suggested was small and intimate, with exposed brick walls and the kind of comfortable, mismatched furniture that encouraged long conversations. Elena arrived first and chose a table near the window, wanting to be able to see Louis approaching and gauge his mood before he sat down. When he walked through the door 10 minutes later, Elena was struck by how tired he looked. Louis had always been the family diplomat, the one who smoothed over conflicts and helped different generations understand each other. Now he looked like someone carrying a heavy burden, his usually neat appearance slightly disheveled, his expression troubled. "Elena," he said as he sat down across from her, and she noticed that he used her chosen name rather than the Sarah her father had thrown at her the night before. "I'm so sorry about last night. I tried to stop it, tried to convince them to handle this privately, but they wouldn't listen." Elena felt a rush of relief that at least one family member was approaching her with compassion rather than accusations. "Louis, I don't understand what happened. One minute I was cutting my wedding cake, and the next minute I was being called a fraud and told I don't belong in the family. How did we get from point A to point B?" Louis rubbed his face with both hands, looking older than his 32 years. "It started about 2 weeks ago," he said quietly. "Tia Carmen got a call from someone claiming to be from the adoption agency that handled your placement. They said that there had been a clerical error discovered in their old files, that you had been placed with the wrong family by mistake." Elena's heart began to race. Someone called Carmen. Who? What agency? "That's where it gets complicated," Louis said, his voice dropping even lower. "The person on the phone claimed to be from Pacific Coast Adoption Services, but when Carmen tried to call back to verify the information, the number was disconnected. When she looked up the agency online, she found out it had closed down 15 years ago." Elena felt a chill run down her spine. So the call might have been fake? Someone might have been lying to her?
Luis nodded grimly. "That's what I think, but Carmen was convinced the call was legitimate. She said the person knew too many specific details about your placement. Your birth date, the hospital where you were born, even some information about the adoptive family in Oregon who was supposed to receive you." What kind of information? Elena asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Names, dates, details about their background, and why they were seeking to adopt. Information that wouldn't be public record, that someone would only know if they had access to confidential adoption files. Elena tried to process this information. If someone was feeding her family details about the adoption that were too specific to be fabricated, it suggested either access to legitimate records or an incredibly sophisticated deception. Did Carmen record the call? Did she get any documentation? That's the other weird part, Louise said. A few days after the phone call, Carmen received an envelope in the mail with photocopies of what looked like official adoption documents. Birth certificates, court orders, correspondence between the adoption agency and both families. Everything looked legitimate, but they were all copies, not originals. Elena thought about the envelope Rosa had brought to the reception, the official-looking papers that had been used to justify destroying her wedding night. Luis, who else knew about this? How many people were involved in planning what happened last night? Luis looked uncomfortable, shifting in his seat and avoiding her eyes. Elena, I need you to understand that everyone was hurting. When they saw those documents, when they realized you might not be biologically related to us, it felt like they'd been living a lie for 27 years. But I was living the same lie, Elena exclaimed, her voice rising enough to draw glances from other cafe patrons. If there was a mistake, if I was placed with the wrong family, I had no knowledge of it. I've been deceived as anyone. I know that, and I tried to tell them that. But Elena, you have to understand the context. This family has always prided itself on loyalty, on taking care of our own. When Abuelo came from Mexico with nothing, when he worked 3 jobs to bring the rest of the family over, when he built the business from scratch, it was all about keeping the family together, about making sure Martina's blood took care of Martina's blood. Elena felt sick. So because I don't have Martina's blood, I don't deserve their loyalty? That's not what I believe, Louise said earnestly, but that's how some of them see it, especially the older generation. They feel like they invested emotionally and financially in someone who wasn't really family. Elena thought about all the family gatherings, all the quinceañeras and graduations and holidays where she'd been celebrated as a Martinez, the money her parents had contributed toward her education, the way her aunts and uncles had treated her as their own niece, the pride her grandmother had expressed in her achievements. Had it all been conditional on genetics? There's something else, Louise said reluctantly, something that made them even more suspicious. Elena braced herself for another revelation, another piece of evidence that might be used against her. 3 months ago, someone started asking questions about you at the community center where you work. A woman called asking about your background, your family connections, whether you were really Mexican-American or just spoke Spanish fluently. Elena's blood ran cold. What woman? What did she want to know? The receptionist who took the call said the woman claimed to be a researcher doing a study on bilingual social workers, but she was asking very specific questions about your person.
Of course, Louis said immediately. But Elena, I need you to be prepared for the possibility that some of what they told you might be true. If there was an adoption, if there was some kind of mix-up, it doesn't change how I feel about you, but it might change how you feel about yourself and your place in the world. Elena nodded, understanding that Luis was trying to prepare her for emotional as well as legal revelations. I think I'm ready for the truth, she said. Whatever it is. I just need to know that I have at least one family member who will stand by me regardless of what we discover. You do, Luis promised. And Elena, even if every single document confirms that you are biologically Sarah Chen and not Elena Martinez, you're still my cousin. You're still the person who helped me with my college applications, who babysat my kids when they were small, who made me laugh through my divorce. DNA doesn't erase shared history. As they prepared to leave the cafe, Elena felt something she hadn't experienced since the wedding reception: hope. Not hope that the adoption story would turn out to be false, or that her family would suddenly apologize and welcome her back, but hope that she could navigate this crisis with her sense of self intact. But as they walked toward Luisa's car to drive to the county clerk's office, Elena's phone buzzed with a text message that made her blood run cold. It was from an unknown number. "Stop digging into things that don't concern you, or the next surprise won't be glass in a cake. Some secrets are buried for good reasons." Elena showed the message to Luis, who immediately took a screenshot before the text could disappear. "Elena," he said grimly, "I think we're about to discover that this adoption situation is just the beginning of something much more complicated." The San Francisco County Clerk's office occupied the entire third floor of a gray government building downtown, its fluorescent-lit corridors and bureaucratic efficiency a stark contrast to the emotional chaos Elena had been navigating for the past 18 hours. She sat in a hard plastic chair between Luis and David, clutching a manila folder that contained what might be the most important documents of her life. "Elena Martinez?" the clerk called from behind the bulletproof glass partition. Elena stood on unsteady legs, her heart hammering as she approached the window. The woman behind the glass looked bored, completely unaware that she was about to hand over papers that could fundamentally alter someone's understanding of their own existence. "I need a certified copy of my birth certificate," Elena said, sliding her driver's license through the gap at the bottom of the glass. The clerk typed something into her computer, frowned, typed again, then looked up with the kind of expression that Elena had learned to dread over the past day. "Ma'am, I'm showing some irregularities in your file. You're going to need to speak with a supervisor." Elena felt David's hand on her shoulder, steadying her as they were directed to a small office where a middle-aged man named Robert Kim sat behind a desk covered with stacks of official forms. Kim had the patient demeanor of someone accustomed to delivering complicated news to confused citizens. "Ms. Martinez," he began, consulting his computer screen, "your birth records show some unusual circumstances. According to our files, your original birth certificate was amended when you were 3 months old, following a legal adoption. The amendment was processed through Pacific Coast Adoption Services." Elena exchanged glances with Luis, both of them recognizing the name of the agency that had allegedly been shut down for fraudulent practices. "What does that mean exactly?" Elena asked. "It means," Kim explained, "that you have 2 birth certificates on file. The original certificate lists your birth parents as James and Lee Chen and your name as Sarah Chen. The amended certificate, issued after the adoption, lists your parents as Miguel and Isabella Martinez and your name as Elena Martinez." Elena felt the room tilt slightly. After all the speculation and uncertainty, hearing the truth stated so matter-of-factly was almost anticlimactic. "So the adoption really happened," she said quietly.
Yes, but that's where things get complicated, Kim continued. The adoption file contains some irregularities that were flagged during a state audit 15 years ago. There appear to have been documentation errors, possibly involving multiple children born around the same time. David leaned forward. "What kind of errors?" Kim consulted a thick file folder. According to the investigation report, Pacific Coast Adoption Services had a pattern of mismatching infants with prospective parents. In some cases, families who were expecting children of specific ethnic backgrounds received children from different families entirely. The agency appears to have been more concerned with processing adoptions quickly than with ensuring proper matches. Elena felt sick. "Are you saying that I was given to the wrong family deliberately?" "Not deliberately," Kim clarified. "More likely through negligence or incompetence. The investigation found that the agency often had multiple infants in care simultaneously, and their record-keeping was extremely poor. Infants were sometimes placed with families based on availability rather than the specific matching criteria that had been agreed upon." Lewis spoke up. "Mr. Kim, what happened to the family that was supposed to adopt Sarah? What happened to the Martinez family that was expecting a child?" Kim flipped through several pages in the file. According to these records, Miguel and Isabella Martinez were indeed matched with a different infant, a baby girl born to a Mexican-American mother who had specifically requested that her child be placed with a Latino family. That infant was supposed to be placed with the Martinez family, while Sarah Chen was supposed to be placed with the Chen family in Oregon. Elena's head was spinning. Wait, so there's another woman out there who was supposed to be raised as Elena Martinez? Where is she now? Kim's expression grew more grave. That's where the situation becomes even more complicated. The infant who was supposed to be placed with your adoptive parents was never actually placed anywhere. According to the investigation files, that baby disappeared from the agency's care and was never located. The silence in the office was deafening. Elena felt David's hand tighten on her shoulder, while Luis made a sound that might have been a gasp or a curse. "Disappeared how?" Elena whispered. "The investigation was never completed," Kim admitted. When Pacific Coast Adoption Services was shut down, many of their files were incomplete or had been deliberately destroyed. The FBI opened a case, but without cooperation from agency staff and with most of the documentation missing, they were never able to determine what happened to several children who had been in the agency's care. Elena stared at the papers in front of her, trying to process the magnitude of what she was learning. Not only had she been placed with the wrong family, but somewhere out there was a missing woman who was supposed to be Elena Martinez, whose disappearance had never been solved. "Mr. Kim," David said carefully, "is there any way to find out what happened to the missing infant? Are those FBI files still available?" Kim nodded slowly. The case was never officially closed, just suspended due to lack of leads. You could contact the FBI field office and request information under the Freedom of Information Act, though that process can take months. Elena felt overwhelmed by the complexity of what she had uncovered. What had started as a family confrontation about her identity had revealed a decades-old mystery involving fraud, negligence, and possibly kidnapping. "There's one more thing," Kim said reluctantly. "Ms. Martinez, someone else has been inquiring about your records recently. About 3 months ago, we received a request for information about your adoption file."
A woman who claimed to be a genealogy researcher helping clients trace family histories. She provided proper identification and seemed legitimate, so we provided her with the basic information that's available to the public. But now, given the suspicious circumstances surrounding the recent contact with your family, I'm wondering if that request was connected to whatever's been happening to you. Elena felt pieces of a puzzle clicking together in her mind. Someone had been systematically gathering information about her adoption, her background, her family connections. That same someone had then used that information to contact her family with devastating revelations designed to destroy her relationships and humiliate her at the most important moment of her life. "Mr. Kim, do you have a name for this genealogy researcher? Any way to contact her?" Kim consulted his files again. The request was made by someone named Patricia Wong, representing Chen Family Research Services. She provided a business address in Oakland and seemed very professional. Elena felt David tense beside her. "Did you say Chen?" he asked quietly. Kim nodded. "Yes, Chen Family Research Services. She specifically mentioned that she was trying to help members of the Chen family locate relatives who might have been placed for adoption." Elena's heart began racing as she realized the implications. Someone using the name Chen, possibly related to her biological family, had been investigating her background and gathering ammunition to use against her adoptive family. But who and why? "Mr. Kim, I need copies of everything in my file. Every document, every investigation report, every piece of correspondence you have related to my adoption or the agency that handled it. That's going to take some time to compile, and some of the documents might be redacted due to privacy laws concerning other parties involved." "I don't care how long it takes," Elena said firmly. "I need to understand what really happened, and I need to figure out who's been trying to destroy my life."
As they left the county clerk's office 2 hours later, Elena's folder had grown to include nearly 50 pages of documentation: birth certificates, adoption decrees, investigation reports, and correspondence between various agencies involved in her case. But rather than providing clarity, the documents only raised more questions about who had been orchestrating the recent events and why. "Elena," Louis said as they sat in David's car in the parking garage, "we need to talk about what this means for your relationship with the family. Even if someone else has been manipulating the situation, the basic facts are still true. You were adopted, you weren't biologically related to us, and your adoption involves some kind of fraud or mistake." Elena looked at the documents spread across her lap, trying to absorb the reality of what she'd learned. "Luis, do you think it changes anything? Do you think the family will be able to accept that I had no knowledge of any of this? That I'm as much a victim of the adoption agency's mistakes as they are?" Luis was quiet for a moment. "Some of them might. But, Elena, I need to be honest with you. There are family members who feel like they've been deceived for 27 years, regardless of whether the deception was intentional. They're not going to get over that easily." David spunk up from the driver's seat. "Elena, I think we need to focus less on winning back your adoptive family and more on figuring out who's been manipulating the situation. Someone with access to confidential adoption records has been systematically gathering information about you and using it to cause maximum damage to your life. That's not just cruel, it might be criminal." Elena nodded, understanding that David was right. Whether or not she could repair her relationships with the Martinez family, she needed to protect herself from whoever was targeting her. "David, can you contact that FBI field office Mr. Kim mentioned? I want to know everything they uncovered about Pacific Coast Adoption Services and what happened to the other children involved."
"Already on it," David said, pulling out his phone. "But, Elena, I think we should also try to contact this Patricia Wong, the genealogy researcher who was asking questions about your records. If she's legitimate, she might have information that could help us understand what happened. If she's not legitimate, we need to know who she really is." Luis offered to help with the investigation, and Elena felt grateful to have at least one family member willing to stand by her during the crisis. But as they drove back toward the Mission District, Elena's phone began buzzing with a series of text messages that made her stomach clench with dread. The first was from her Aunt Carmen. "Elena, we've been thinking about what happened last night, and we need you to return any family heirlooms, photos, or documents that rightfully belong to the Martinez family. Since you're not actually our relative, you have no right to keep them." The second was from her cousin Maria. "My kids are asking why Elena isn't their prima anymore. I told them she was never really their cousin anyway. Don't contact them again." The third was from a number she didn't recognize. "The Martinez family has asked me to inform you that you are no longer welcome at family gatherings, holidays, or celebrations. Any attempt to contact family members will be considered harassment." Elena felt each message like a physical blow. In less than 24 hours, she had lost not just her parents and grandparents, but her cousins, her aunts and uncles, her nieces and nephews, an entire extended family that had been the foundation of her social and emotional world. But the final message was the one that made her blood run cold. "Stop investigating things that don't concern you, or you'll discover that family rejection is the least of your problems. Some people disappear permanently when they dig too deep into the wrong histories." Elena showed the messages to David and Luis, both of whom immediately recognized the threat for what it was. Someone wasn't just trying to isolate Elena from her adoptive family. They were threatening her safety if she continued to seek answers about her background. "That's it," David said firmly. "We're going to the police. These aren't just cruel family dynamics anymore. Someone is making threats against your safety." But as they drove toward the nearest police station, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that they were already in over their heads. Whatever had started as an adoption mix-up decades ago had evolved into something much more dangerous, involving people who were willing to go to extreme lengths to keep certain secrets buried. The question was,
What had happened to the real Elena Martinez, the baby who was supposed to have been raised by Miguel and Isabella? And who was so determined to prevent Elena from finding out that they were willing to threaten her life to keep her quiet? As if reading her thoughts, Luis spoke up from the back seat. Elena, I've been thinking about something. If the baby who was supposed to go to our family disappeared from the adoption agency, and if someone is now threatening you to stop investigating your background, what if those two things are connected? She turned to look at him, seeing her own fear reflected in his eyes. What do you mean? What if, Luis said quietly, the person who's been manipulating this situation is someone who knows what really happened to the missing baby? What if they're trying to drive you away from the family and stop you from investigating because you're getting too close to uncovering something they've kept hidden for 27 years? Elena felt a chill as she considered the implications of Luis's theory. If he was right, then her adoption mix-up was just the tip of an iceberg that concealed a much darker truth about what had happened at Pacific Coast Adoption Services and what had become of the children who had disappeared from their care.
3 days after Elena's wedding had turned into a nightmare of family rejection and identity crisis, Detective Liu called with news that would change everything Elena thought she understood about her situation. Elena, I need you and David to come to the station immediately. Detective Liu's voice was tense with urgency. We found Patricia Wong, and what she's told us is going to shock you. But more importantly, we've also found the real Elena Martinez. Elena's hand shook as she hung up the phone. After days of speculation and fear, the moment of truth had arrived. She was about to meet the woman who should have been raised by Miguel and Isabella Martinez, the woman whose identity Elena had unknowingly been living for 27 years. The drive to the police station felt both endless and too short. Elena's mind raced with questions about what the real Elena Martinez would be like, whether she would be angry about the life that had been stolen from her, whether she would demand some kind of restitution or revenge. But when Elena and David walked into Detective Liu's office and saw the woman sitting across from the desk, Elena's first emotion wasn't fear or guilt. It was recognition. The real Elena Martinez was clearly Mexican-American, with the warm brown skin and dark eyes that would have made her a perfect match for Miguel and Isabella's biological daughter. But more than her appearance, something about her presence felt familiar to Elena in a way she couldn't immediately explain. Elena Chen, Detective Liu said carefully, I'd like you to meet Elena Martinez. Elena Martinez, this is Elena Chen, the woman who was raised by your biological family. The two women stared at each other across the small office, each seeing in the other a reflection of the life they might have lived. Elena Martinez was dressed in scrubs, and Elena Chen noticed a hospital ID badge clipped to her shirt pocket that identified her as a pediatric nurse at UCSF. I've been looking for you for 15 years, Elena Martinez said quietly, her voice carrying a slight Spanish accent that Elena Chen recognized as familiar from her own childhood memories. Ever since I turned 18 and started trying to understand why I felt so disconnected from the family that raised me. Elena Chen felt a jolt of surprise. You felt disconnected too? Elena Martinez nodded. I was raised by the Johnsons in Oregon, wonderful people who loved me dearly, but I always felt like something was missing, like I was supposed to be somewhere else, with different people living a different kind of life. I spoke English perfectly, but I dreamed in Spanish. I had no interest in the foods my adoptive parents preferred, but I craved spices and flavors I'd never tasted. When I got older, I realized I was probably meant to be placed with a Latino family. Detective Liu cleared her throat. Before we go any further, I need both of you to understand what Patricia Wong has confessed to. Elena Chen, the threats you've been receiving, the campaign to isolate you from your adoptive family, Patricia Wong orchestrated all of it. David spoke up. What kind of money are we talking about?
Detective Liu consulted her notes. Elena Chen, when your biological parents died, they left behind a substantial estate, property, investments, and life insurance policies worth approximately $1.2 million in 1997 money. Adjusted for inflation and growth over the past 27 years, that estate is now worth over $3 million. Elena's hand shook as she hung up the phone. $3 million? The estate was held in trust for Sarah Chen until she reached the age of 25. When no legitimate Sarah Chen came forward to claim it, the estate remained in trust.
Limbo. Patricia Wong has been serving as the trustee, collecting administrative fees and hoping that the real Sarah Chen would never be found. Elena Martinez spoke up. But I was also supposed to inherit something, wasn't I? Detective Liu nodded grimly. Elena Martinez, your biological mother specifically chose to place you for adoption with a Mexican-American family, and she left instructions that you should be told about your heritage and your biological family when you turned 18. She also left a smaller inheritance, about $50,000, to ensure you could afford college education. I never received any of that information, Elena Martinez said, her voice thick with emotion. The Johnsons never knew about my biological mother's wishes because Patricia Wong never forwarded the information to them. She kept the inheritance for herself. Elena Chen stared at the two women in front of her, Detective Liu with her professional composure and Elena Martinez with tears in her eyes, and felt something fundamental shift in her understanding of the situation. So Patricia Wong has been stealing from both of us for years? She's been keeping my inheritance and yours. And when she realized I might start investigating my background, she decided to destroy my family relationships so I'd be isolated and easier to manipulate. Exactly, Detective Liu confirmed. Wong's plan was to approach you after you'd been cut off from your support system, claim that she could help you understand your identity and connect with your biological family's estate, then convince you to sign documents giving her continued control over your inheritance in exchange for her assistance. Elena Chen felt sick as she realized how close the plan had come to working. If David and Luis hadn't supported her, if she'd been truly alone and desperate after losing her family, she might have been vulnerable enough to trust someone who offered her answers and financial security. Detective Liu, Elena Chen asked, what's going to happen to Patricia Wong now? She's been charged with fraud, theft, conspiracy, and making terroristic threats. Given the amount of money involved and the duration of the scheme, she's looking at significant prison time. More importantly for both of you, the court has ordered that all stolen assets be returned to their rightful owners. Elena Chen turned to Elena Martinez, suddenly aware that they needed to address the complicated dynamics of their situation. Elena, I need you to know that I never knew about any of this. I never knew I was living someone else's life or that there was money involved. If I could go back and change what happened... Elena Martinez held up her hand to stop her. Elena, can I call you Elena or would you prefer Sarah? Elena is fine. It's been my name for 27 years. Elena Martinez continued, I don't blame you for any of this. We were both victims of Patricia Wong's manipulation and the adoption agency's negligence. You didn't choose to be placed with my biological family any more than I chose to be placed with yours. Elena Chen felt tears welling up in her eyes. But you missed out on knowing Miguel and Isabella, on growing up with that culture, on being part of that family. And you missed out on knowing James and Lee Chen, on understanding your Asian heritage, on having access to your biological family's estate. We both lost things, Elena, but we also both gained things. The Johnsons were wonderful parents who loved me unconditionally. And from what Detective Liu has told me, Miguel and Isabella loved you the same way, at least until this recent crisis. Detective Liu cleared her throat. Speaking of Miguel and Isabella, Elena Chen, I think there's something you should know. Your cousin Luis has been in contact with several family members, and there's been some evolution in their thinking about your situation. Elena Chen looked up hopefully. What kind of evolution? When Luis explained that you'd been victimized by Patricia Wong, that you'd had no knowledge of the adoption circumstances, and that someone had been deliberately manipulating the family to turn them against you, several people began to reconsider their reactions. Your grandmother in particular has been asking Luis when she can see you again. Elena Chen felt her heart leap with hope, but she was also wary of setting herself up for more disappointment. What about my parents? What about Miguel and Isabella? Detective Lu's expression grew more cautious. They're processing the information. Luis thinks they're ashamed of how they treated you at the wedding, but they're also struggling with feeling deceived and manipulated themselves. It may take some time for them to work through their emotions. Elena Martinez spoke up. Elena, would you be interested in meeting Miguel and Isabella? I've been curious about them my entire life, and if they were meant to be my parents, I'd like to understand what I missed. Elena Chen stared at her in surprise. You want to meet them? I think it might help all of us process this situation, Elena Martinez explained. They lost a daughter they never got to meet. I lost parents I never got to know. And you lost the family that raised you because of circumstances none of us controlled. Maybe if we all meet together, we can find some kind of healing. Detective Lu nodded approvingly. That might be beneficial for everyone involved. Luis has already suggested something similar, and he thinks Miguel and Isabella might be more receptive to reconciliation if they understand the full scope of what happened. Over the following week, Elena Chen found herself navigating a series of emotional encounters that would have been impossible to imagine just days earlier. First, she met with her grandmother, Abuela Rosa, who cried and apologized and held Elena's hands while explaining that she'd never stopped loving her, regardless of what any adoption papers said. Mija, Abuela Rosa said in Spanish, her voice thick with emotion. You are my granddaughter. You have been my granddaughter for 27 years. Biology doesn't change the love in my heart or the memories we've shared. Then came the more difficult meeting with Miguel and Isabella. Elena Chen's parents sat stiffly in Luis's living room, clearly uncomfortable but making an effort to engage with the situation they had helped create. Isabella looked like she'd been crying for days, while Miguel appeared angry, not at Elena, but at himself and the circumstances that had led to their family's crisis. Elena, Miguel said carefully, we owe you an apology. We reacted out of shock and hurt, but that doesn't excuse the way we treated you at your wedding. You deserved better from us, regardless of what we learned about your adoption. Elena Chen felt years of tension and uncertainty finally beginning to dissolve. Papa, I understand why you were hurt. I wish I had known about the adoption so I could have helped you process it in a better way. Isabella spoke up for the first time. Mija, we failed you. We let our emotions override our love for you, and we made decisions and anger that we regret deeply. Can you forgive us? Elena Chen looked around the room at the faces of people who had shaped her entire understanding of family and love. Despite everything that had happened, despite the cruelty and rejection she had experienced, she knew that the bonds formed over 27 years were stronger than the shock of genetic revelations. Of course I can forgive you. You're my family. You've always been my family. But the most surprising development came when Elena Martinez joined one of these family meetings and something extraordinary happened. Miguel and Isabella, meeting the daughter they were supposed to have raised, felt an instant connection that seemed to heal something fundamental in all of them. You have your biological mother's eyes, Isabella told Elena through tears. She specifically requested that you be placed with a family who would honor your heritage and teach you Spanish. Elena Martinez smiled. I taught myself Spanish in college because I felt like I was missing something important. And I've spent my entire career working with Latino children in the hospital because I felt drawn to the culture I was supposed to grow up with. Over the following months, both Elenas worked together to heal the rifts that Patricia Wong's manipulation had created in their lives. Elena Chen gradually rebuilt her relationships with the Martinez family, while Elena Martinez began developing the connections to her biological heritage that she'd been denied for 27 years. The inheritance situation was resolved with Elena Chen receiving the estate from James and Lee Chen, which she used to establish a foundation providing educational scholarships for adopted children. Elena Martinez received the inheritance from her biological mother, which she used to fund a program connecting adopted adults with information about their biological families. But perhaps most importantly, both women found that their identities were more complex and resilient than they had ever realized. Elena Chen remained Elena Martinez in her heart and daily life, but she also began exploring her Chinese heritage and developing relationships with distant relatives of James and Lee Chen. Elena Martinez maintained her close bonds with the Johnson family, while also becoming an integral part of the Martinez family gatherings and traditions. 6 months after the wedding reception that had seemed to destroy Elena Chen's entire world, she and David renewed their vows in a small ceremony in Luis's backyard. This time, the guest list included both Elena Martinez and the Johnson family, representing the full complexity of families created by love rather than just genetics. As Elena Chen danced with her father, Miguel, the man who had raised her and loved her despite moments of doubt and confusion, she felt a sense of wholeness that she had never experienced before. She was Elena Martinez, daughter of Miguel and Isabella. She was also Sarah Chen, biological daughter of James and Lee Chen. She was a woman who spoke Spanish fluently and was learning Mandarin slowly. She was someone who made excellent salsa verde and was discovering a talent for Chinese cooking. Most importantly, she was someone who had learned that identity could be fluid, complex, and multifaceted without being false or fraudulent. She had learned that family could be chosen as well as biological, that love could survive revelations and mistakes, and that healing was possible even after the deepest betrayals. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Elena Chen found herself standing with Elena Martinez, watching their shared family members interact with the easy familiarity of people who had chosen to love each other despite complicated circumstances. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we'd been placed with the right families from the beginning? Elena Martinez asked. Elena Chen considered the question seriously. Sometimes. But then I think about all the people I love who wouldn't be in my life if things had been different. David, Luis's children, my colleagues at work, even the clients I've helped over the years. My identity crisis led me to work with immigrant families because I understood what it felt like to feel caught between cultures. If I'd been raised by Chinese parents, I might never have developed that particular form of empathy. Elena Martinez nodded thoughtfully. I feel the same way. Working with Latino children in the hospital has been my calling, and it came from feeling connected to a culture I was supposed to be part of. If I'd been raised by Miguel and Isabella, I might not have had the same motivation to serve that community. As Elena Chen prepared to leave with David that night, she reflected on how dramatically her understanding of herself and her place in the world had changed over the past 6 months. She had begun the year as Elena Martinez, secure in her identity as part of a large, loving Mexican-American family. She had endured a period of being rejected as Sarah Chen, a stranger whose genetics supposedly invalidated her entire existence. Now, she was simply Elena, a woman whose identity encompassed multiple heritages, families, and possibilities. The foundation she had established with her inheritment was already helping dozens of adopted children access educational opportunities that might otherwise have been unavailable to them. Her work at the community center had expanded to include support groups for adult adoptees navigating identity questions. And her marriage to David had been strengthened by weathering a crisis that tested their commitment to each other in ways they had never anticipated.
2 years later, Elena stood in the doorway of her grandmother's kitchen, watching Abuela Rosa teach Elena Martinez how to make tamales from scratch. The scene was both surreal and perfectly natural. 2 women who had never met until their late 20s, but who shared a connection that transcended genetics and adoption paperwork. Elena Martinez's hands moved confidently as she spread masa across corn husks, guided by the patient instruction of the woman who would have been her grandmother if circumstances had been different. The secret, Abuela Rosa was saying in Spanish, is to add just a little bit of the pork broth to the masa. It makes them more tender. Elena Martinez nodded, concentrating intently. Over the past 2 years, she had been learning not just Spanish, but the entire cultural inheritance she had missed during her childhood with the Johnson family. She approached it with the dedication of someone making up for lost time, but also with the wisdom of someone who understood that identity was something you built, rather than something you were simply given. Tia Elena, Luis's daughter Isabella called from the living room, can you help me with my science project? Both Elenas turned toward the voice, then looked at each other with amused smiles. After some initial confusion, the family had developed a system where Elena Chen remained Tia Elena to Luis's children, while Elena Martinez had become Tia Elena M. It was a small accommodation that reflected the larger truth. Both women had earned their places in the Martinez family through love and shared experience, not just biology. Elena Chen left the kitchen to help with the science project, marveling, as she always did, at how normal these family gatherings had become. The first few months after the truth about Patricia Wong's manipulation had been revealed were marked by awkward conversations and careful emotional navigation. But gradually, the family had developed new rhythms that incorporated both Elena's, both the Johnson family and the Martinez family, both the painful history and the hopeful future. In the living room, Elena Chen found Miguel and David deep in conversation about David's latest project at the nonprofit. Over the past 2 years, Miguel had made conscious efforts to rebuild his relationship with Elena, but he had also developed a genuine friendship with David that existed independently of the family drama. They shared an interest in community organizing and social justice that had surprised everyone, including themselves. Elena, Miguel called out when he saw her, David was just telling me about the scholarship program's expansion. You've helped over 200 kids now? Elena smiled as she sat down with Isabella and her science project, a volcano that needed last-minute adjustments to its baking soda and vinegar ratio. 215 as of last week. And Elena M. has connected 67 adult adoptees with information about their biological families through her program. The Elena Foundation and the Martinez Family Heritage Project had become their joint legacy, two programs that transformed the pain of their adoption mix-up into resources for other people navigating similar challenges. Elena Chen often spoke at conferences about identity and belonging, sharing her story to help other adoptees understand that their experiences were valid regardless of the circumstances of their placements. But perhaps more importantly, both women had discovered that their individual identities were richer and more complex than they had ever realized. Elena Chen had spent the past year learning Mandarin and had traveled to China to visit the village where James Chen's family had originated. She had found distant relatives who welcomed her with curiosity and warmth, expanding her understanding of her biological heritage, while also deepening her appreciation for the Mexican-American culture that had shaped her daily life. Elena Martinez had become a regular presence at Martinez family gatherings, but she had also maintained her close relationships with the Johnson family in Oregon. Her adoptive parents had initially struggled with the revelation that their daughter's placement had been a mistake, but they had come to understand that love and family weren't diminished by complexity or multiple loyalties.
Elena, Isabella said, looking up from her volcano project, my teacher says that families come in all different shapes. Is that why we have two Tia Elenas? Elena Chen smiled at the 10-year-old's straightforward wisdom. That's exactly right, Mija. Families can be biological, adoptive, chosen, or any combination of those things. What makes them real is love and commitment, not just genetics. Isabella nodded solemnly and returned to measuring baking soda. I think having two Tia Elenas is better than having just one. You teach me different things. As the evening progressed, Elena Chen found herself standing on the front porch with Elena Martinez, watching the sun set over the Mission District. The view was the same one Elena had looked at from various family porches throughout her childhood, but her appreciation of it was deeper now, informed by understanding how precious and fragile family connections could be. I've been thinking about Patricia Wong lately, Elena Martinez said quietly. Elena Chen nodded. Patricia Wong had been sentenced to 8 years in federal prison for fraud, theft, and conspiracy. But perhaps more importantly, her prosecution had led to a broader investigation of adoption fraud that had helped dozens of other families find answers to questions they had carried for decades. "Do you ever feel sorry for her?" Elena Chen asked. Elena Martinez considered the question. "I feel sorry for whatever happened to her that made her think it was acceptable to steal from children and manipulate families for profit. But I don't regret that she was caught and punished. How many other people did she hurt over the years?" Elena Chen agreed. The investigation had revealed that Patricia Wong had been systematically defrauding adoptees and their families for over 20 years, collecting fees and maintaining control over inheritances that rightfully belonged to others. Her arrest had freed not just Elena and Elena Martinez, but numerous other victims who had been living under her manipulation without even realizing it. "Elena," Elena Martinez said, turning to face her, "I want to ask you something, and I hope it doesn't sound strange." Elena Chen looked at her with curiosity. "Do you think we're sisters? I mean, not legally or biologically, but in some deeper way? We shared the same crisis. We helped each other heal from it, and we're both part of the same extended family now." Elena Chen felt a warmth spread through her chest as she considered the question. Over the past 2 years, she and Elena Martinez had developed a relationship that was unlike any other in her life. They weren't quite sisters, weren't quite friends, weren't quite cousins, but something entirely their own. 2 women bound together by shared trauma and mutual healing. "I think we're family," Elena Chen said finally. "Not the kind of family that gets defined by official documents or legal relationships, but the kind that gets created when people choose to love and support each other through difficult circumstances." Elena Martinez smiled. "I like that definition."
As they prepared to go back inside, Elena Chen's phone buzzed with a text message from Detective Liu. Even 2 years later, the detective occasionally updated Elena on developments in cases related to adoption fraud or identity theft. Tonight's message was brief but significant. 3 more families reunited thanks to information uncovered in the Wong investigation. Your willingness to speak publicly about your experience is making a real difference. Elena Chen showed the message to Elena Martinez, who smiled with satisfaction. Both women had made the decision to speak openly about their experiences, despite the personal cost of having their private struggles examined in public forums. They had testified at Patricia Wong's trial, participated in documentaries about adoption fraud, and spoken at conferences for social workers and adoptive families. "It's worth it," Elena Martinez said, reading Detective Liu's message. "Every family that gets reunited, every adoptee who gets answers to their questions, every corrupt adoption worker who gets caught because people are paying attention now, it's all worth the discomfort of sharing our story." Elena Chen nodded in agreement. The work wasn't easy, and there were still days when she felt overwhelmed by the complexity of her identity and the ongoing responsibility of representing adoption issues in public forums. But she had learned that healing wasn't just a personal process. It was something that could be shared, taught, and passed on to help others navigate similar challenges.